Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining the Climate Adaptation Research for BC Agricultural Virtual Workshop. My name is Sean Smuckler. I'm Associate Professor and Research Scientist at the University of British Columbia. I'm also the Chair for Agriculture and Environment. It's a great pleasure to be the host for this panel. I do want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from UBC, which is on the unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and show my gratitude for being able to work here. So the panel that we're joining for is to discuss how the agriculture sector can play a role in carbon sequestration. Experts in this field are going to speak about how agricultural carbon sequestration can be monitored, measured, and verified. The discussion will also identify barriers to implementation as well as the opportunities that are out there. So for the first hour of this session, I will be introducing the panelists one at a time and posing questions to them. And then we'll reserve 20 minutes or so at the end of the session so that the audience can get their questions addressed. So if you have questions as we're going, please use the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen. And then feel free to upvote a question. So you can just click on that thumbs up if you have the same question. And then we'll sort through the question, pose those to the panelists. So I'd like to start by introducing our first panelist, Cedric McLeod, the Executive Director of the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association. Cedric received his post-secondary agricultural degree from Dalhousie Agricultural Campus and his master's in soil science from the University of Manitoba, with a focus on Canadian prairie agriculture and production systems, including extension, consulting, and research. Cedric has nearly 2 decades of entrepreneurial experience as president of McLeod Agronomics, an agro-environmental consulting firm specializing in the analysis and integration of sustainable agricultural practices in the Canadian ag sector. He also operates local Valley Beef, a grass-fed beef ranch in Western New Brunswick. 2021 is Cedric's 6th year as executive director in the CFGA. Cedric, great to see you again. So I'd like to start by asking you if you could describe briefly what has been accomplished so far with the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association's Canadian Grassland Protocol project.
Wonderful, thanks, Sean. Thanks so much to the organizers for the invite, and glad to see, just pleased to be on with so many esteemed colleagues here that I haven't seen face to face in so long. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. So 5 things. We did it. We built it. And when we started out I guess I should step back. When I started with the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association, we're going through a review of the strategic plan. One of the key items that was missing, I guess, from our portfolio for the Canadian grassland sector was the lack of a comprehensive soil carbon quantification protocol that could be used at commercial scale. So we said, let's fill this gap. And so through the agriculture greenhouse gases program with Ag Canada, call came out, we put in a proposal and got it. And there was a lot of folks that said, you just can't do it. We don't have the data. And it turned out we didn't have the data to do exactly what we started out with. But we did land with an avoided conversion protocol. So not so much focused on what Ed and Locke had talked about this morning in terms of accumulating carbon, but recognizing current carbon stocks and keeping them sequestered and avoiding that conversion. So that was where we landed. When we started, we were certainly looking to identify carbon stock changes from X for practice A, kind of the research that Dr. Fraser talked about in the last session. But the amount of data that we had, and well, it's too granular. We just couldn't come down to a sequestration rate per BMP. So we said we'll have to go with with the avoided conversion. Now we do have some plans, and hopefully I'll mention that a little bit later on as the conversation goes. One thing we did do through that process is we identified, as we built the protocol, we identified the gaps and the challenges that we need to address with data in order to move towards a practice-based protocol. Again, where we can incentivize or quantify and monetize carbon under specific grazing regimes or with the implementation of a specific best management practice. So that's led to the development of a soil carbon roadmap concept, which I think, Sean, you were part of that original proposal. We'll talk about that again, hopefully a little bit later. The other outcome of that project, which we're quite proud of, is a BMP guide for Canadian forages on how to either increase sequestration rates or decrease your overall greenhouse gas emissions from the forage system. And so that includes both grazing and stored forage systems. So great applicability for, beef, sheep, bison, dairy, all the ruminants that would be using those forages. And what I'll do when you introduce the next speaker, I'll put a couple links in the chat, one to the BMP guide and then one to the actual avoided conversion of grasslands protocol.
That'd be great.
So folks can take a look at it. Followed up from that project, we landed a pilot project with Shell Canada. We work closely with Tom in his capacity at EVP and CCA, and now with NCC as well. So we're taking that avoided conversion of grasslands protocol, putting it on the landscape, learning, understanding tips, tricks, challenges, and opportunities that go along with that. And we are looking to get a pilot project started in BC. So I'm really glad to have the invite today. I'm putting that shingle out. I have talked with Serena from BC Forage Council about advancing that project, and it's our plan to get a kind of a strategy put together this winter. So maybe we can talk about that as the day goes on as well. The last thing, I mentioned it earlier, is the soil carbon roadmap. So we recognize that with the lack of data consistency that we have project to project, region to region, institution to institution, the use of various methodologies to either sample, measure, or store data, right? We're not having a consistent approach across the country. Lots of work being done to understand carbon sequestration rates and BMP impacts, but we're not doing it as a collective so that the database that comes out of that can inform a practice-based quantification protocol. So that was where we put together that soil carbon roadmap. We applied for some funding through ECCC, weren't successful on that one, but we are looking at, there's another round coming. We're hoping to trigger that. One thing we have found, Sean, again, you were part of that process. Some of the other applicants to that same pot of money were successful in getting their research funding, and now they're coming back because we had put together that consortium. They're saying, okay, wait, how do we do this? How do we measure? So they're asking, they're recognizing we need this carbon roadmap. We need this consistent collaborative approach. So hopefully that'll trigger some funding. We can pull that together. So I was told to be brief. Hopefully that was brief enough.
That was perfect, Cedric. Yeah, it sounds like you guys have been busy, to say the least. And yeah, I really appreciate the points about the need for coordination. I think that's critical. So the next panelist I'd like to introduce is Tom Lynch-Staton. He's the Regional Vice President of the Alberta region of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Tom he has held senior roles with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. He's most recently been with Alberta Beef Producers as the head of government relations and policy. He's been a mentor in the Cattlemen's Young Leaders program, and he sat on various councils and advisory boards. Beyond collaborating with Alberta's ranching community and levels of government, Tom has a passion for the outdoors. He's concerned about the loss of native grasslands, which are among the world's most endangered ecosystems. Tom also has experience co-managing a fourth-generation cattle operation in Alberta's foothills. So Tom, yeah, it's great to meet you. I think this is the first time we've met. Can you describe again briefly the Nature Conservancy of Canada's work with ranchers with respect to carbon sequestration in grasslands?
Absolutely, and thanks for the the kind introduction, Sean. Yeah, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. Really like talking about this stuff and the new work we're doing in carbon sequestration, trying to generate carbon credit revenue for ranchers, you know, as part of the pilot project that Cedric talked about. So NCC's work, especially in the prairie provinces, along with as well some work in BC, we work primarily with private ranches and ranchers in conservation, and the way we do that is through conservation easements, typically on landscapes. We do have land that gets donated to us or partial interest donated to us, and those are permanently held easements, a bundle of rights that we purchase or have donated to us to conserve grasslands. But we also believe very much so that conservation can be symbiotic with working landscapes. And so that's why ranchers are so important in conservation, because they're already to, you know, a very, very large degree or most degree already very much aligned with the conservation outcomes that we're trying to do. Now, in terms of carbon sequestration, as Cedric said, we're piloting this new carbon credit protocol, the avoided conversion of grasslands carbon credit protocol, and I was involved in helping develop the pilot project with Cedric and all the other groups that were involved. NCC was a group involved at the time. I was in a previous role, and really the work getting underway in that pilot project is to test this carbon credit protocol on grasslands. And where NCC and other land trusts can play a really nice role is to generate or to unlock, I should say, the carbon credit revenue potential on grasslands to be able to develop, register, and market carbon credits from the avoided conversion of grasslands. You need to have a qualified land conservation agreement. And one of those agreements is a conservation easement, which we already do and already provide. So essentially what we're doing is working with ranchers right now as we speak. We've got 3 ranches in the pilot in Alberta where we've put a conservation easement on recently that will hopefully unlock these carbon credits, which will generate extra revenue for the ranchers. Be able to do that for over the 30-year time frame of a carbon credit project. So that's kind of in a nutshell how we're working right now. Again, we're figuring out all the intricacies of developing and registering a carbon credit. And it's, you know, in Canada, it's brand new, and so we are learning as we go. It is quite fun. I see a lot of potential across the prairies for this carbon credit protocol to be applied, but there's certainly going to be a lot of work to make it happen, and we're going to learn. We're going to learn as we go some of the things that work or don't work in getting this protocol developed and implemented. So I'll just leave it there because I'm sure there's going to be lots of other discussion on this.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Tom. Quick clarification. So for these 30-year contracts, what happens after the 30 years?
Great question. So the protocol was developed on a 30-year time frame. So that's essentially, Cedric, I wonder if I should go into the details or I'll start confusing people, but the 30-year time frame is deliberate for it's based on because it's an avoided conversion protocol, it's based on as if you actually cultivated the land or developed it, converted the landscape, and it would take approximately 30 years if you were wanting to replenish that carbon that was released into the atmosphere. So I always like to pull this stat from Ed Bork, and I don't know if he's still listening or not, but the stat that says when you convert native grassland, you lose right away 30 to 50% of the carbon storage in that grassland. So it takes about 30 years if you were trying to replace that carbon back to equilibrium of what it was before, and that's the time frame of the carbon credit. And so in that time frame, that's where you're generating credits. You're registering those credits on a market. Right now, we've got the protocol adapted in a voluntary market in the US called the Climate Action Reserve. And so once these credits are developed, you're able to sell them, and you'll have a 30-year, every year you will generate credits that you will be able to sell over 30 years. Now, after 30 years, you're still required because it is you have to keep that carbon in the ground. You can't release that carbon after 31. You're committed for another 100 years to keep that carbon in the ground. So that's keeping the carbon credit legitimate, auditable, and making sure that when people are purchasing these carbon credits, that they are actually getting carbon storage, and it's permanent storage for 130 years. So I hope that.
Yeah, that makes me feel better. The 30 years sounded like a short time horizon, so 130 years sounds good to me. Thanks for that clarification. So the next panelist that I'd like to introduce is Dave Zender. He's the manager of the Farmland Advantage program. David and his family own and operate a cattle ranch in Invermere. David is passionate about agriculture and ecology. He works as an advisor with the Environmental Farm Plan here in BC. He has sat on several boards, including the Canadian Cattlemen's Beef Cattle Research Council, Investment Agriculture Foundation, the University of Alberta's Rangeland Research Institute. He's also the vice chair of BC's Agricultural Land Commission. He has spearheaded a research and development project in BC and in Alberta known as the Farmland Advantage, which he continues to work on. Dave will be telling us more about Farmland Advantage and its connection to carbon sequestration throughout the panel. Dave, it's great to see you again. And, the first question I have for you is, can you describe Farmland Advantage's program model, and how would this model be applied to projects that are trying to sequester specifically carbon?
Sure. Thank you very much for the question, and thanks for the invite. Nice to be with such a great group of people. And the first thing I wanted to say is I'm not a carbon expert, so I'm not pretending to be a scientist with any kind of carbon expertise, but we do work with experts, and we do find the best research and the best science to support the work that we do. Farmland Advantage is a program that we've been developing in collaboration with a lot of people on this call over the last number of years. And the basic idea is it contracts farmers to take on extraordinary actions to protect and enhance the ecosystem, and that's to provide benefits like clean drinking water, carbon sequestration, and healthy wildlife populations. The type of concept is commonly referred to as a payment for ecosystem services program. So that's the basic concept. The model that we use employs a process by which we target sites. We usually have a working groups at the provincial and regional levels who help to guide and they include scientists who help to guide our work. And then we contract farmers to take on these projects through a formal paid contract arrangement. And we also have a significant monitoring component. It's interesting to hear from Cedric and from Tom. I mean, this has been an ongoing problem of data gaps in Canada and in British Columbia. So we actually looked at first starting with the primary focus of carbon and carbon sequestration, but quickly realized that was going to be some time before that information and these protocols were developed. So we shifted our focus to more of the co-benefits, and with the assumption that we would always get back to the carbon component when the science was advanced and when the monitoring got down to where the cost benefit, was there. There's some unique attributes in BC, and that we're in such a heterogeneous landscape that it really provides challenges when you try and talk about practices and how they affect carbon in the landscape. That being said, we did, for instance, piggyback off of the research at Thompson River University and worked with Locke Fraser. So the concept we were testing is, can we use this model of contracting farmers in the carbon context in British Columbia? And to test that, we selected his sites and offered those producers a contract to take on some of the co-benefit pieces, and just to see whether the same producers who were interested in sequestering carbon would also be interested in participating in a larger program with a bigger focus, which included co-benefits. And I know I saw a lot of the shaking heads, so that's going to be a focus of a lot of our work. Other examples include a current grazing project. It's more of a grassland health project, where we're working to contract farmers to take on special actions to maintain grasslands for species at risk, and also for catastrophic fire mitigation. And so in that, there is an assumption that when we contract farmers to be maintaining healthy grasslands, that conversion that everybody's referring to is not happening, because our understanding of the science is such that that's where the largest and most obvious release of carbon happens, is when we till up that ground for the first time. And so, but when we look at the trajectory of land use in British Columbia over time, especially in our grasslands, the conversion has been going on. And so those are a couple of examples how we would specifically use our protocol. It's not a protocol, it's our program model in that example. And we work with you again, Sean. We'll be working with you to be on our monitoring, where we're specifically digging soil and taking those carbon measurements directly on to measure, to see how the sites that we're contracting, how those sites are responding, and to the BMPs, and how the carbon is responding in those sites. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, and we're definitely looking forward to collaborating with you on that, and I hope we can demonstrate that we've got the science to the point where it is going to be cost effective to monitor changes in carbon. So our last panelist is Kevin Boone. He's the general manager for the BC Cattlemen's Association. Kevin's a third generation rancher on a family homestead in Delia, Alberta. Later relocated his family cattle operation to Tomahawk, Alberta. As producer, he has volunteered his time to many committees and organizations, including the Alberta Beef Producers, the Canadian Cattlemen's Association, the Canadian Beef Export Federation, the National Checkoff Organization, and the Beef Information Center. Since 2009, Kevin has embraced his position as general manager with the BC Cattlemen's Association. His previous experience as a rancher, combined with his years spent volunteering with industry, affords him an understanding and knowledge to represent BC cattle producers in his role as manager. Kevin, it's nice to meet you, and I'm glad to have you on this panel. The question that I have for you is, why is carbon sequestration important to the BC cattle sector? Can you share some of your perspectives on the opportunities of implementing carbon sequestration practices here in the province?
Absolutely, and thank you, Sean, for the introduction. And I'm happy to say that every face on this panel is pretty familiar to me. I've worked with each of these guys over the years, and I'm happy to do it. And it's an honor to be on a panel with them on such an important subject too. So thanks for that. And I will add to that by saying I'm even less of a carbon expert than Dave is. And so what I'm coming to the table with, I think, is more of a production aspect on what this means to us. And maybe I'll add a little bit in on what we are doing as an association to honor this. And I think that, if we go back through history, it's important to realize that forage, number one, is our lifeblood. Without forage and without water, we don't have a cattle industry. And British Columbia is one of those unique geographical areas and topographical areas where we have so much of our land that is really not well utilized or suited for other types of agriculture, but for raising protein on the hoof, it's extremely beneficial. And up until we started really seeing the global focus on carbon and the effects on climate and everything else, we were just worried about a healthy ecosystem and making sure that soil was healthy without necessarily understanding the importance of carbon to that. I think that with that realization along the way and understanding the importance of our plant structures and what's there, and the keeping of that soil intact has become even more important to us. And to be able to be an industry that depends on that forage for another reason, and for the primary reason basically of feeding our populations, and knowing how important that's going to be over time, it's great to know that the cattle and that production can be a tool to enhance that. And I think, the other thing that we have to look at here, especially in BC, where we have a lot of competition on that crown land. 95% of the land in British Columbia is crown land. And as such, we have to have a focus on all the aspects that are useful in there. And timber has certainly come out with high protocols for carbon and being heralded for that. But we know the value of carbon. And I sometimes think that, go to the old saying of we can't see the forest for the trees. I would say in BC, we can't see the forage for the trees. And I think that that's a problem. I think that we need to create a balance out there. We saw in some of the presentations this morning from Dr. Bork and Dr. Lachlan Fraser of the value of that balance out there. And I think that's a big part of it, is creating a balance. The benefits to us in recognizing the carbon sequestration, comes not only in that ecosystem and the value of what that soil composition is to every bug and every grub and every other piece of plant life that grows there, but the value of a healthy forage system to feed our cattle and produce that protein. That is an essential part that we sometimes forget in the discussion, where very often we see the cattle being blamed for burping and farting out there, but they don't understand that value in other aspects of having them there is extremely important. So some of what we see in this research is definitely substantiating what our beliefs are and the value of that forage and what we do on it. But it also builds a social license for us. And I don't think that can be underestimated in value for us, because we have a lot of, I would say, sentiment out there for anti-livestock agriculture, and it spills over into the politics of climate change and everything. And so I think that that is a big part of it. And it's one of the things where the protocols being adapted and work like what Dave's group is doing is important to us to show that value, but also it's important for us so that people understand that there is more out there than just the what they're seeing and the value there. So I'm going to leave it at that, because I can rattle on all day, and it's just a little bit different aspect on it, and where we are working with the likes of Dr. Fraser on certain things, targeted grazing for wildfire. I could go on, but I'll leave it at that for now, Sean, and let you carry on with the other guys that do know something about it.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Don't worry, we'll come back to you to give you some more rattle time. For now, I'm going to go back to Cedric. Cedric, Dave had mentioned the challenge of the cost effectiveness of monitoring and verification. What do you think is important for our audience to understand in terms of how we do this in grasslands? Or if we were to phrase this another way, what kind of proof do producers need to show to track GHG benefits in their practices?
Right. Thanks for the question, Sean. I guess Dr. Bork had alluded to this in the previous session. The incremental changes that we see under grasslands, it's really, really hard to see it through measurement, right? It takes a big data set, a very intensive sampling effort. Then we get into depths and analysis methodologies. There's a whole jumble of it. So what ends up happening is we use the models, right, for prediction. And when we use models and that goes into a protocol, it allows us to get into the marketplace. Does it mean that, we lose some opportunity? Yes, it does. We have to deploy conservativeness within those protocols to make sure we're not overestimating. So are some ranches going to be leaving some on the table? You bet. Does it allow them to get into the market? Yes, it does. And that consistent approach allows us to go to a regulated market, right, where we're shooting for that $1.70 a ton. Tom had rightly said earlier, we're currently in the voluntary space through the Climate Action Reserve. We've been lobbying Alberta Environment Parks to bring the avoided conversion of grassland protocol forward into that Alberta regulated marketplace. We're lobbying Jackie Mercer and her team to get that into Canada's national offset program. And if you take a look at the list of protocols that they intend to deliver, our project that Tom and I are involved in received honorable mention. So they're watching very closely what we find and how that can be brought in. So long answer to say it's really, really tough, which is why I come back to that soil carbon roadmap concept. And folks like yourself and Locke and Ed and Dave Burton and Derek Lynch down here at Dalhousie University in Halifax, right, agreeing to a methodology and a data sharing effort so that we can start to really fine tune those models will allow Tom's brother Jim to apply those coefficients, and I can apply my coefficients at Local Valley Beef right here in Centerville, New Brunswick, and the market is still going to be happy with it, because that's the ultimate challenge, right? We can go out and do all kinds of sampling and spend all kinds of money, but if Shell Canada says, that's good, Dave, you sampled your entire farm very intensively and you've got your carbon stock, but that doesn't get us to our, how many millions of tons of targets, right? So we have to be thinking globally here and how we can advance as a sector. And like I say, we're going to leave a little bit on the table in the time being, but at least we're going to get there. And, my suggestion is let's do it sooner than later, because as Ed said, we're going to be at $1.70 here at 2030. And if we're still trying to figure this out in 2030, we're going to miss out on the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Cedric. Again, yeah, the coordination just seems critical. Getting these data sets into a database that we can all share and utilize it seems like the next big step we need to take. Tom, I'm wondering if you have some thoughts on that as sort of the go between the markets and the producers. What are your thoughts on the verification and monitoring, and are there some lessons that you want to share from the pilot project that Cedric and you are working on?
Yeah, I think going into this, kind of looking back 3 or 4 years, the opportunity to try to recognize the value of ecosystem services that are provided to society on a ranching landscape, specifically where cattle are also being managed. I mean, it goes above and beyond simple carbon sequestration. There's biodiversity, there's wildlife, there's nutrient cycling, water filtration, all those ecosystem services and wildlife habitat. I mean, all the ranchers and ranchers we work with, like there's an abundance of wildlife species and species at risk on these landscapes, and they're doing okay. So, you know, carbon, you know, and the thought was, you know, one of the low-hanging fruits is carbon stored in the soil, and how could we at least use that as a proxy for recognition of ecosystem services that ranchers on the landscape are providing. Now, probably one of the main challenges is that it's not as it's a lot more complex of you know, trying to get a carbon credit protocol for an avoided conversion method in place. And there's so much to think about because we have to also keep these carbon credits legit, that there is a true threat to conversion. That's one of the key factors to being able to get this protocol registered. So if there's no threat to conversion, you could have a beautiful grassland, but you won't be able to generate carbon credits, because it really is that threat to conversion that is the main trigger to do this. But as Cedric said, you know, measurements and verification, ensuring that it's robust and conservative to ensure that the carbon credits are legitimate is going to be very important moving forward. From a producer's standpoint, I mean, have to recognize as well that currently, I mean, we want to be able to get some extra revenue into the rancher's hand, and that's partly a recognition of the good work they're doing on the landscape and stewardship. And I think part of the challenge is what they have to commit to generate carbon credits. And that's a tough decision for ranchers, because you are taking some rights away of what you can do on the landscape. And sometimes, you know, ranchers have to make that hard decision where economically, you know, canola might be the way to go to just keep their family going, right? And that's a very tough decision. And generating carbon credits now restricts them from that flexibility. And that's going to be a very big challenge for producers to kind of think about, that they have to give up some of their what if flexibility to ensure that they can generate carbon revenue. And that's a really tough challenge to think about, because you are trying to protect, you know, some flexibility for your kids and the next generation, and try to keep it so that you have the what if scenario to take care of things if you have to. That being said, I think most ranchers really do believe in keeping their ranch intact and the grasslands, and it's really a last resort when they do have to convert. So I think ideally most ranchers really do want to keep those grasslands intact, because they love them, and they're very proud of them. So but there's certainly lots of challenges with the protocol. It's not as easy. It's a great concept, but it's quite a bit more complex than we think. So
yeah, it's a bit of a bummer of all the ecosystem services that we can gain from these landscapes. It's the carbon market that's really the one that we're having to start with because of the complexity there. So on that note, Dave, you had mentioned that you were going to try to avoid the carbon quantification because of the challenges. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what you see some of the biggest challenges and research gaps are? You know, what do we need to tackle to really make this operational in your mind?
Sure. Yeah, I think that, like, you know, a lot of they've already said it, and I think we're all on the same page here. It sounds like, in terms of the panel, these are challenges around you know, this quantification. We do lack data. Like, you know, you look at the American model, the COMET model, for example. There's such high quality data in the United States by comparison, you know, for the way that areas have been mapped and the data level of data that they have there. So that's of course a challenge, and that's already been mentioned. specifically in British Columbia, again, I mentioned that heterogeneous landscape. The other thing to remember is we have, Kevin will give us a better number, but it's over 130 different forms of agriculture in British Columbia using this very small land base. Most of the land base is in the hands of the province. And we only have about 1.5 or maybe 2.5% of the land in private agricultural land. So we have a tiny fragment of that land base in that private landowner. The other thing that we have in British Columbia is extreme land values. You talk about a vineyard who they're paying $300,000 an acre for land to turn into a vineyard, and they're native grasslands, and they're taking them and they're turning them into a vineyard. And how do you present? you can't hang the carrot of carbon credits even at $170 a ton, I don't believe, to convince someone from a business perspective to not spend, to not convert it to a vineyard when they paid $300,000 an acre, and try and compete with that is very difficult. That being said, I think that our disadvantage in BC is also a form of advantage, and that is that with those high levels of heterogeneity and the ecosystem heterogeneity comes very high levels of biodiversity and very different forms of biodiversity. And so I believe the key to this all, and I have, as I did right from the get-go, is that combining those co-benefits, and Tom touched on it a little bit, and I know Cedric understands it very well too, and many of the call do, that we need to tap into the co-benefits, especially in BC, because we aren't talking about massive chunks of uniform land that are all managed the same. But it's in fact that what might be seen as a weakness in the heterogeneity could actually be turned into a positive. And that's where we're working with species at risk and looking at protecting communities through farm management from catastrophic fire. Those are all things that are opportunities that come with some of those challenges. So hopefully we can keep developing, the protocols. But and again, and I know it's not the focus, but it has been one of the pitfalls in the past, is where there's been a hyper focus on carbon sequestration to the exclusion of the co-benefits, and you end up in some really weird places, like where they're planting trees. British offset programs for carbon, planting trees on British Columbia, like London, England, or British as in London, England, British, are planting trees in British Columbia on BC farmland to offset carbon, and that's a weird situation, especially if they start planting those on native grasslands.
Yeah, I think that's a clear example of why we really need to be bundling these services, and it's another area where we really need to coordinate the research. Cedric was pointing out that we need to coordinate across the quantification of carbon projects, but then we also need to be really working on the co-benefits at the same time. And that for sure is, that's a team effort. Yeah, Cedric, you want to follow up on that?
Well, and I would suggest on that too, like we need to be working across departments, right? Like we need to get trees planted, the 2 billion trees initiative, that's under NRCan. Right, we're trying to work through agriculture. A lot of the greenhouse gas work is coming through ECCC, right? So coordinating, at the industry level and at the research level, but also at the government level, because there's some pretty stark differences in, grassland inventory numbers and carbon stocks, even between federal departments. So we need to get that aligned.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Kevin, what are your thoughts on what would encourage producers in the province to adopt, say, this avoided conversion practice, or some of the other beneficial management practices that were mentioned earlier in the morning by Locke and Edward? What would get producers engaged and motivated to participate?
Well, a big part of it is definitely the research that's going on here and the values in this data of how much carbon is being sequestered. And I agree with Dave 100%, where there's so much focus on the carbon end of things that we forget about the other values. But at the end of the day right now, we're having a real fight in BC just to retain the forage that is out there growing naturally on the sides of those mountains, and not from as much from the vineyards and stuff, although they are out there, but those other, and there's actually 250 different commodities that are marketed here in British Columbia agriculturally. But where I'm going with this on that Sean, is we need to, and the value to our guys is to be able to produce as much or more forage than what we already are. That is our commodity that we need, and our reward is in what we're trying to produce to sequester carbon. So there's a big part of that. Dave also mentioned, that those added benefits are those unseen benefits that are there. And all too often, the ranching industry and the cattle industry are seen to be the offenders to certain things. And species at risk is a great example where all too often it's felt that our cattle are killing these and everything. Well, contrary to popular belief, a lot of those species that are out there that are at risk are there because of us, not in spite of us. And it's that habitat and those ecosystems that are being created out there that are unique to the croplands and everything. We're not tearing it up, we're leaving it intact, and that's where they're at. The common example I'll use is a burrowing owl. We saw them being decimated. There were things put in place to protect them that actually eliminated them, where they were setting aside land. And so what crop farmer was going to set aside 80 acres for a burrowing owl when you can just plow right over top of that nest? Whereas out on these grasslands, it's imperative that they have some growth of grass, that they have that grass so they can see their predators coming at them. So we have to utilize, and this is where that data and the knowledge and the research really comes into play to educate the consumer and the average Joe that's in the lower mainland and downtown, because they get their information from the highly reliable Facebook. And, I always say that Facebook has been successfully spreading rumors since 1998. And that's a lot of what happens there. And we need to get some facts out there that is substantiated. We need to get some research out there that shows the other benefits other than, it used to be that good, healthy, wholesome protein that we produce naturally on that grasslands was enough. It's no longer enough. And so the benefit to us in that ranching industry is really that ability to keep using those lands, keep utilizing that forage and turning it into protein and doing it in an economical value that's not only a value to that rancher's pocketbook, but a value to everybody that's out there that is part of the society for those carbon and that environmental benefit.
Yeah, it really seems imperative that we educate the consumer onto what the benefits are, and to make sure that they're making decisions with the best available data. But Kevin, I want to ask you, do you have a sense of how many producers that you work with are using some of the practices that Locke and Edward talked about in terms of, say, mob grazing or more intensive grazing? How much potential is there to move management to a new system that would actually be providing more carbon benefits and more co-benefits? Do you have some sense of that?
Well, so it's very hard to quantify, and in BC it's a little different, where we have different areas, and those lower valley areas where the private land is, will have smaller producers on smaller acreages of land that will utilize mob grazing, rotational grazing, and whatnot, much more than the vast rangelands, which we depend on for the forage for the major part of our herd. But I would really in some ways say that they always have incorporated a lot of those, but just in a different manner. If you look at how our cattle behavior works. You know, we turn our cattle out in the valleys basically in the spring, and they graze their way up the mountain, and then in the fall they graze their way back down. So they're rotational grazing throughout the year in that process. And I'll point out that as they graze their way up and graze their way down, they don't earn or utilize one bit of carbon fuel, and they come back with about 600 pounds of protein in the fall. That's a pretty efficient way of producing food out there without utilizing carbon. And in the results, and if you look at some of the work that Dr. Fraser and Dr. Bork have done of the value of that grazing and that root development in the carbon that is being put in place, this is something that's been done all along. I think that one of the projects that Dr. Fraser done several years ago in the grazing pattern showing that stem to root ratio and that value was just the practices that are there in our forage plans for our cattle producers on that licensed land to graze, in keeping the stubble height the way it was and everything, really enhanced, and a calculation could have been made, and probably with the research now can be much more effectively made, of how much extra carbon that does store. If you know, 95% of our grazing land is crown land, what is the value to the crown of that storage that is being done on their land through the use of our cattle on their forage? And you know, if you put how many tons per hectare per year are being stored extra because of that grazing practice, then we're providing a tool to do it. And it may not be our cows that are actually sequestering that carbon, but they are providing the tool to do it. And I think that there's data coming in of the value of grazing over a mowing mechanical method that's there. So that cow all of a sudden may not be the tip over for anything, but they're adding to it. And we need to look at everything that contributes to make that a whole system.
Great. Yeah, Cedric, what are your thoughts on adoption and shifting practices? It sounds like from Kevin that a lot of our producers are already doing the right thing, and maybe we just need to be doing better accounting. What do you see more on a national level in terms of changing management practices and opportunities, and then the barriers for producers to adopt new practices?
Yeah, you bet. I think, I mean, great example, Kevin. I love that natural rotational grazing up and down the mountain. So true. And I think the short answer is it depends. And as we talk about grazing management across the country, we need to be very cognizant that, you know, there's different styles that need to be deployed, right? And you know, we're currently working on a national grazing mentorship project. So we're getting back to it. We've seen, you know, announcements through the federal on-farm climate action fund with grazing management being a key component of that. So we're going to see some funds flow from Ottawa out to farms and ranches across the country that are going to help to deploy the kinds of things that Locke was talking about this morning, right? That good quality pasture, that good dry matter production, that good cattle productivity, and all the myriad of EG&S benefits that come along with that. So how do we see that adoption move forward? We need to work, you know, closely with the grower and not be necessarily prescriptive, right? But understand the goals of what you're trying to achieve. And I think to Kevin's point, there's a lot of goals that are already being achieved that we haven't necessarily quantified, right? And we're doing those things just because that's inherent in what we do, but working with them to set some of those specific goals so that they can measure, monitor, and then convey those goals, I think will maybe encourage more folks to step in on it and adopt more advanced grazing management practice. You know, I think one of the challenges, and I'm dealing with it out here, there's a perception that if you run rotational grazing, then you've got to come home from your day job and move cattle at noon. And I don't know where that perception came from. I hear it from some government staff, shockingly, right? Like we know that good grazing management can give us what, 25, 50, maybe 75% better dry matter production depending on your climate zone, right? So I know in my case, I run rotational grazing and my cows get moved every 3 days. And it takes me literally 7 minutes out of my day to open a gate because they know when I open the gate, they're going to fresh grass. So Kevin had mentioned the animal movement and understanding, herds and how they flow. Quite honestly, out in this country, a lot of our continuous grazers, like they would take an entire weekend to round up the cows because they can't move them. They don't have control, right? It's a big deal, big roundup, jamming them in somewhere, putting them on trucks and everybody balling and going it. But understanding that animal movement allows us to manage the landscape and achieve numerous goals. And again, identifying those goals one-on-one with the grower through a trust relationship with a mentor, I think is a way to see that through.
Yeah, you're just making the issue more and more complicated. So it's not just about how complex the measurement is, it's also that there's huge variations in the systems across the country. Yeah, it's
one thing I should say is we got to get back to having people on the landscape ready to go.
Yeah.
Like we haven't got the extension services that we once did. We don't see the focus on forage management like we once did at the university level. Like we've missed a generation of people that can get out and go one-on-one with the grower because we know that on-farm support is critical for designing and deploying systems.
Yeah, I think the evidence clearly shows that we need to bring that back, or some form of it back. Tom, what are your thoughts on trying to take the model that the Nature Conservancy has developed and to franchise that? How do we get more of these types of projects out there on the landscape, the ones that you're piloting?
Well, it's a great question. I just wanted to touch quickly on, just on the grazing practices. One thing that we learn over time, before I was a rancher, and growing up on a ranch, we're always learning and we're always trying to improve. And one fundamental thing that I think any rancher out there today realizes is that your success as a rancher, as a business, is tied directly to the health of your landscape. And when that health of the landscape is not maintained, you won't be in business very long. And that's a pretty fundamental truth to anyone who's going to be a sustainable ranching business. But we're always learning how different grazing practices help in maintaining the health of that landscape. And even recently we're learning, grazing mechanisms. You talked about boom and bust, works quite well in certain types of forages, might not work as well on a native grassland where your rest period is probably needs to be quite a bit more. If we think about how these grasslands evolved originally with bison. So, if you're thinking about 5 million bison coming across a landscape, they graze it pretty hard, but they probably don't return for 5 years. Whereas in a cell grazing on a tame pasture, those plants were bred and grown to grow quickly, be cut, and then grow again. And so that's why you can have a different grazing practice, a kind of a cell grazing practice. So we're kind of, we're still learning. And I think we're doing a pretty good job at continuing to improve those methods to ensure that a greater landscape remains healthy. When we talk about like, how do we increase adoption, or maybe what are the barriers to adoption? I think that was your question. Or
well, I was trying to be a little more specific in terms of the model that you've got right now. Seems like that's a particular approach to really trying to capture carbon on the landscape that might be different from some of the other producer approaches.
Yeah, so the model we have, what we're trying to do, so the tool we use mostly is a conservation easement. And a conservation easement is essentially we're purchasing or we're partnering with a landowner to essentially purchase rights to that land. So the right to convert the land, the right to cultivate, develop, subdivide. Those are kind of the main things. And that's intended to keep the landscape whole. And then we try to work with the landowner after that on stewardship practices. We raise funds, a stewardship endowment fund when we're doing these projects to help, pay for the cost of improving stewardship practices. So it's really, we're trying to look at it as a partnership approach. The challenge though, and the challenge that has always been, and conservation easements are kind of contentious out there, and it's because it's a permanent, you as a landowner are giving up permanent rights forever. So while that's great for conservation, flexibility for the next generation, locking in the next generation to a certain, the things you can only do with that landscape are not very appealing to some people. So it's a really hard decision for people to make. But they get, when they do make that decision and they work with us, that has value, and so they can get some cash in their pocket. It helps maybe if they're trying to buy some more land or keep the business going. So there is that. But now with potential for carbon revenue, we see this as just a extra incentive that recognizes good stewardship already, adds on to the value of a conservation easement by getting the rancher some ongoing annual revenue into their pocket. And I think that's quite appealing, and that should accelerate conservation across the prairie grasslands and the grasslands of BC, if there's enough revenue there to make it worthwhile. It just gives, again, that 30 years of some security that they've got a constant revenue stream to help them in those decisions and helping them steward the landscape as they've committed to.
Dave, do you want to make a comment following that up?
Yeah, I think Tom raises some good points. I think one of the things that's fundamental to the potential of this is understanding the economics to the producer. And our focus is about making this a good business decision for the farmer. So much of what we do is dependent on as the farmer as being a charitable person and donating. And what the greater society doesn't realize is how little ranchers make in terms of their investment and the work that they do. The return on investment is very, very small in that, generally speaking. So a large focus of our program is to really focus on the costs and the benefits that farmers accrue when they are involved with our program and our projects. So we spend a lot of time capturing that data of the costs to the farmer, the benefits that they generate to themselves. Where is their break even? Because we do not want to be impoverishing them any further for two reasons. One is we're going to lose them off the landscape and lose all the benefits that they bring. But also that if the limiting factor is the pocketbook of the farmer, in terms of what they could potentially do, we're limiting the potential upside to society. There's such massive potential upside to society by supporting ranchers and farmers in these activities. If we say, well, we're only going to do that if the farmer does it voluntarily, or if they, just barely squeak by on it, we are going to miss a huge opportunity. If we do that analysis, we say, what's the bottom line for the farmer? And then we also look at the societal benefits. So the societal benefits are often 10 or many exponentially times more beneficial than the investment that you put into the farmer. Some of the analysis showed very, very conservatively a 1-to-10 ratio. If you invest $1, you're going to get an immediate return of $10 by investing in this type of programming to support farmers, especially when you combine co-benefits together and capture dollars from that are not just carbon dollars, but also dollars related to biodiversity or fire mitigation and those other things, and you funnel those all through one common funnel to the farmer, then he can hit a critical mass of dollars and saying, you know what, it is worth it for me to manage that way. I can, from a business point of view, make this work. And this is a business decision that makes sense to me. And so I always say it's a fair deal to the farmer, and it's a fantastic deal to society. So that's really, really important. And then Tom talked about, some of the limitations of covenants. I mean, we've looked at it on our own ranch. It's a long process and some very deep thinking, especially in a family setting. Those of us who live in big families know the challenges of getting everybody to agree to something that's permanent on their land base. So that's what Farmland Advantage does. It offers some incremental opportunities where an in-between option to the covenant, or we can do a covenant to say, the covenant is simply not to subdivide the land. And then we come in and contract them to take on other extraordinary actions in addition to that. And it's easier for them to say, look, I just don't want to subdivide the land. I can agree to that permanently. But my management practices, I can't lock those in for 100 years or whatever these guys want me to do. But we can offer that kind of intermediary ground with this ultimately infinitely flexible tool in these agreements. We can make them for 1 year, we can make them for 100 years, we can make them contain whatever the farmer is willing to do. And there are legal limitations to what a covenant can constrain on the land base, especially in British Columbia with the Land Commission and Land Reserve. So I think bringing these elements together, there's tons of potential to find the optimal combination of things that will really benefit agriculture.
Yeah, well said, Dave. And talking about covenant and land stewardship, it brings to mind what the role of First Nations here in BC are in terms of the opportunities and in terms of land management. I guess I'll open this question up to all of you. How are First Nations in BC being engaged in these types of projects?
I can address that a bit, Sean. I think number one, not enough, but number two, there's much more, and we all know that the First Nations and the Indigenous between DRIPA, which is UNDRIP, in the actual legal form here in British Columbia now, where it is actually an act. There's a lot of requirements out there in other areas, but a lot of times what we're not doing is we're engaging them, and government is engaging First Nations in a lot of the legislation and regulation and that end of things. And they're getting their opinion or input on some of what is done on the land, but we're not actually bringing them yet into the picture. And we need to do that. And I know Trevor Kempthorne is on here today, and he's from the First Nations Agricultural Association. And I've worked with Trevor on certain things, but there's a lot more we need to work on. They have different values, but there's other things that are involved in that forage out there. They do, food gathering is a highly cultural aspect of what they do and what they need out there. And they need the forage out there, and they need that land base to do it. But their wildlife and everything else that the forage, they depend on the forage, is also there. And it's not just a matter of consulting with them. It's a matter of bringing them in and making them a part of the solution. I think is going to be a much more beneficial aspect. If we can, it's about building partnerships and not just asking for permission or asking for what has happened in the past. It's seeing that way forward in the future, because there's a saying out there of there's a reason our windshield is so big and our rear view mirror is so small. It's that we have to look ahead, but we have to have the rear view mirror to see what's happened as well. And so how do we do that aspect of it? I think that it resonates too. I want to take a bit of a step back in some of what Dave said too, and that economic value of the whole picture. I agree wholeheartedly with Dave. And one of the things though that we're not looking at and is we've got so many different ratios out there. And when he talks about the preserving and not subdividing, and Tom talks about keeping them in chunks, this is where societal influence and what I call, the urbanization of rural Canada, or the rural world, where we're seeing more and more urbanites wanting to move out into rural BC and get a piece of it. That's great, but as we break that land up, then we have to change our practices. And we're seeing in the valleys here in BC where it's more productive land, where that gets utilized first. We'll have to go to a more and Dave might shoot me for this because he's studied the Swiss model a lot because he has a Swiss background, but it's a European model that you have to do of how do you get the most out of smaller acreages. That's where things can benefit in things like carbon sequestration, where we do more of the intensive grazing, the rotational grazing, and utilizing different methods than the normal rotation of working up the mountain and down. It depends on what that landscape allows, but more importantly, what is society's influence on that landscape that we have to adjust to. And with all the carbon aspects of the world today, we see a lot of money. I'd love to know how much money was spent on the conference in Glasgow on carbon, and think of what if we took that money and put it into climate adaptation through what we're doing on the landscape. How much benefit will we have there, rather than trying to build a strategy for zero carbon emissions by 2050 out there. And we have to look at how do we invest in the right things. For climate change has happened for billions of years, going to continue to happen. It's how we responsibly adapt to that and implement things to help prolong and better that adaptation to that change.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Certainly, adaptation is going to be critical. That should be clear to everyone right now. I do want to make sure that we open the conversation up to the audience. There are a number of questions in the Q&A, and I'd like us to get to them. And I also want to encourage the audience to go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A and or upvote questions that you see already there. So to start with, there's a question and some conversation about the idea of integrating alternative crops, particularly food crops, into civil, pastoral, or agroforestry systems. What are your thoughts, guys, on the idea of trying to get more bang from our buck, as the questioner states, out of our landscapes by integrating some food systems and food crops into our pasture lands?
We do have a food crop. It's called a cow. And it's compatible with the ecosystem. It doesn't involve tilling up and releasing a whole bunch of carbon and planting carrots instead of allowing the native grassland forage to exist there. There is, of course, opportunities for that, and I would suggest that they'd be best applied to the already disturbed parts of our landscape, when we can be managing for the native ecosystem in the areas that are at this point undisturbed. If we're learned from what Ed Bork was saying, and the release of carbon in tilling and releasing those carbons out of alternative practices.
Tom, you have a follow-up to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. If we can think of ways to maximize the efficient use of already disturbed lands rather than converting new lands, I think that's the first goal. And those integrated systems, I really like those ideas of different cropping food systems within one landscape. I think it's where we need to go. I have a good example. I was on another one of these panels with and I can't remember her name. She was a farmer in Ontario, has an orchard. And instead of, mowing and cultivating underneath the apple trees, she really didn't like doing that. So she thought, I wonder if I could get some goats and they could clean up all the apples and graze underneath. And so now she's got an integrated apple orchard, and I think she's got plums and other things too. And then goats eating everything underneath with no extra inputs or anything. And in fact, you know, the goats fertilize. The trees are healthy. They clean up the rotted apples. They clean up the grass, and it's a nice example of rethinking integrated systems to provide more food. And you're getting the ecosystem benefit of keeping carbon in the ground, probably, you know, healthier plants all around. And I think it's a very worthwhile doing that thinking. And it could be, you know, even thinking of, yeah, shelter belts, trees integrated in other landscapes. But the first preference would be, how do we use that disturbed land that's already cultivated, or that's already been changed, to maximize the use of that land first before other conversion happens.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great example of a way to do that. Cedric.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. And I think we keep talking about landscape. And one of the things that we're talking about now quite a bit across the country is that landscape function, right? Not just for the food, right? Water retention, we've already talked about carbon, the habitat, right? So, you know, I mentioned NRCan before, and we're going to get 2 billion trees planted, and their large are going to be, you know, targeted to the forest sector, right? But if you recall, I mean, when PFRA was established out west, there was a shelter belt center in Indian Head, Saskatchewan. I don't know how many thousands of kilometers of shelter belt were placed across the prairies. Right? They served a very logical and important function on that landscape, keep the soil from blowing. Right? Now we're talking, and those were in dry conditions. Now we're talking about wet conditions, talking about variable conditions, and we know how, you know, strategic landscape management and the application of woody perennials along with, you know, our perennial forages, how those landscapes can heal and like say holding water, I guess. I know very pertinent to you guys right now. How do you hold that back on the landscape so it doesn't all come out right at once? So we've modified, we've engineered our landscapes, you know, as a society. So now I think we need to be thinking about form and function and how we place some of these natural features appropriately and effectively to manage some of the risks that's coming down the pipe.
Dave, you want to take a shot at that too?
Yeah, I just think that I get going back to your earlier question about First Nations, and it's interesting. Like the BC Cattlemen's Association has, we used to have an Indigenous Affairs, it was called, our committee, and now we look more at the relations. And it used to be about issues related to the challenges of working as a rancher and trying to deal with issues that might where we might have conflict, but we've shifted our focus to more on how we can work together, as Kevin has said. And if, like, you know, so much is to be learned from those old systems of managing the land, and so we work very, very carefully and closely with First Nations. In fact, some of our projects are led by First Nations, and they're fantastic. There is so much in common between our two communities. It's amazing when we sit down together how actually much we have in common relative to other communities, you know, farming and ranching to First Nations relative to farming and ranching and other kinds of urban environments. So, you know, we had an amazing event this fall to celebrate some of the work we were working with a local, the Shuswap Indian Band, which is the group that had, where they found, unfortunately, the children on the graves in Kamloops. And it was a fantastic event, bringing the farmers and the ranchers together with the First Nations, like in a feast where they were bringing the salmon and the game, and we were bringing all of our beef and other products. It was just an amazing gathering, and it was kind of a snapshot into the potential. Just when we sat down together, it just felt so right. And I think that there's so much potential for us to work together, as Kevin had mentioned. I just wanted to reinforce what Kevin was saying there.
That's a really nice image. Thanks, Dave. Kevin, do you have something to add?
Yeah,
just want to make a couple comments on this, bringing a bit of it together of what some of the others have said and bringing in what Cedric said a bit about that landscape level. But one of the projects, and it was reported on yesterday by Amanda Miller, that we're working on with targeted grazing, and it actually came about because of the wildfires and utilizing cattle in specific areas on a targeted basis to reduce the fine fuels so that we can protect the interface areas between some high value infrastructure and the wildlands, more or less. But one of the things in this that happened during that was that it wasn't a matter of us just going in and putting our cattle out. We were doing that anyway. What it was it shifted a focus on a certain portion of that land to the people that were right beside it that we were trying to protect, being the towns and cities that were there. So it came to the attention. But in doing it and in changing that model that we had to work with on that Crown land, we had to do a different level of engagement and consultation with not only First Nations, but with various stakeholders on that portion of land. And so there's one that we're doing between Peachland and Summerland. And when we got in there and started doing it and started looking at all the values, what we found was we need to bring everybody to the table to be part of this. The cattle are a very, very small part of this, and it's a tool in there. We've gotten a lot of focus off it. But the big value out of this is, yes, we believe we're helping to protect that from future fires to help lessen it. But I would say the bigger value was us all sitting at a table and discussing what is right for that piece of land, for all the values that are coming off that land. And in that, we're doing data collection, as Amanda talked about what are the values to that landscape, to that ecosystem, we got a carbon sequestration value in it. We're looking at invasive plant species at risk, all of that. It becomes a part of, this is what we're going to have to do more concentration on and better effort at, is building landscape level planning on all of our landscape out there. And it's a matter of building the recipe for each land to make sure that we're doing the right thing on each of those acres. And if we need to do something that isn't quite right, what are the things that we can do to offset it on the next acre over? And making sure that those that are doing the work are being fairly compensated for it. Because, for example, the targeted grazing, if that was land that wasn't accessible to us before and we couldn't have been using that forage, then yes, there would have been a bonus. We would have got some extra forage to utilize to produce that protein. As it was, we had access. What we're doing with these practices are actually costing our producers money. They're making less. They're investing in the health of that land for the greater good. And so this is where, as Dave has pointed out, we can't afford to do that and continue to do it. So how do we make it so that society has their way of investing in their future through us for the health of that landscape and what it does for society?
Yeah, so on that note, on the idea of making sure that the producers are effectively compensated, I'm going to point out Dr. John Janmat's question. He's an economist at UBCO, and his question got upvoted quite a bit. And he asked if any of you are looking at annual or short-term offset markets. He's worried about the fact that the carbon that we're talking about is fundamentally unenforceable. You know, we know here in BC we're facing floods and fires, and we don't have a good handle on what that is going to do to the carbon that we're promising to stay out of the atmosphere. It's likely to be putting it right back up into the atmosphere. So, you know, we're talking about programs that are paying producers to lock carbon for 100 years or more. What are there alternatives that you all are investigating? John suggests that maybe the offset payments should go into a fund, and that out of that fund we would distribute annually money, I guess, in a more egalitarian way across the landscape. What are your thoughts on that?
I could maybe start, Sean. It's a great point. There are lots of there's lots of creativity around this whole subject. Everything which John has addressed. There are organizations that are working on short-term payments. ALUS is a great example. ALUS. They will pay a farmer for ecosystem services on an annual basis, 5-year contract type system. I know Environment Canada has also played in that realm as well for lands that have species at risk, for example. So there are other models out there, and a lot of thinking around how this could work. For carbon specifically, I mean, enforcing permanence as a land trust, I mean, this is what we do with conservation easements. They are enforceable. We monitor, we ensure that you know, changes don't happen, or changes that happen are worked on with us, and we mitigate those changes to be at least net zero or net benefit to the environment. So, and that's also why we create stewardship funds that go along with easements, because that's an ongoing cost to NCC and other land trusts to monitor forever, essentially, and enforce when infractions occur. Or significant infractions occur. And you could do that at the same time as monitoring for carbon release. In terms of floods, forest fires, grass fires, etc., within the Grasslands protocol, there is a accommodation for those effects that are not controlled by humans. And so there's a discount factor involved, bond set for when reversals do happen. Luckily, in Grasslands, most of the carbon is in the soil, not in the grass itself. So that helps. In forestry, got to get out of my realm. I know the forestry protocols are different. I don't know how they account for forest fires, but I know that there has been thinking around that. Cedric, maybe you have insight on the other protocols and how they account for those reversals. Oh, maybe not. Okay.
Not in the forestry, Tom. I've only done marginal work there, but I think, the offset markets themselves are, recognize the importance of managing the risk of reversal. So there are some different approaches, I guess, with carbon banks and set asides and different things that can account for that. I think the other thing I would say, well, I jumped right in front of Dave there, but I know there's some look at some short-term, like a term type of easement, right? So you do that in shorter bundles, which kind of goes to Tom's point earlier about the permanence issue. So, that's it's a tricky one, I think, to do the term, but there is some active work ongoing to explore what that would look like, which would hopefully maybe engage some short-term engagement in the markets, and then those would be sequential over time, ideally.
Thanks, Cedric. So Dave, we're going to need to wrap it up here in a minute, but I'll give you the last word here before we close.
Yeah, just to follow up with what Tom was saying. So basically that's what Farmland Advantage can offer, is one year contracts. That's not a problem. We are going to have, I believe, over the long term, we are going to have to bundle carbon and carbon sequestration with the co-benefits to make it economically viable in British Columbia. Plus, we have an additional legal constraint that other regions don't have, and that is in the form of the Agricultural Land Reserve. And the Agricultural Land Reserve does not allow you to covenant things that will permanently eliminate agriculture from the land base. So that's why, but using our mechanism, we can accomplish that in a different way. And we can use our contracts can be anything. They're infinitely flexible. They could be one day, they could be 1,000 years, whatever people are willing to sign on for, but they're not registered against title. So that's a workaround that legal limitation. So anyway, but I think there's a possibility of combining some of these things like the covenant with these management agreements in unique and novel ways that will result in like the optimal kind of arrangement. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thanks so much, David, and thank you all, Tom and Cedric and Kevin. This has been an incredibly interesting conversation, and as one of the founders of BC ACARN and a steering committee member, this is exactly the type of conversation I envisioned us cultivating in this organization. So yeah, I'm extremely grateful that you participated, and I hope that you all will be continue to engage with BC ACARN, as I encourage our audience as well. Cedric, yeah. Go.
I promised Serena that I would plug this. We are working on this pilot project, and we've got to get some things rolling in BC. So Kev, I'm looking over at you. Dave, looking at you. But Serena's keen. I know there's lots of activity there. So that's the buzz, guys. We're going to be coming to a province near you through the BC Forage Council. So hopefully we can work on that.
Nice, perfect, Cedric. So before we close, I do want to acknowledge that this workshop is partially funded by an amazing anonymous donor who has supported ACARN for the last several years, as well as the Canadian and British governments under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is a federal-provincial-territorial initiative. I know there are lots of questions still in the chat. The panelists, if you get a chance to take a look at those, certainly some interesting things to think about. Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining. I think someone was going to share the login for the next section. Is that true? Yes. Okay. So yeah, I look forward to seeing everybody at future BC ACARN events. And yeah, again, panelists, thank you very much for this great conversation. Hope to talk to you soon.